The old rancher was dying, his breath slow and heavy as the quiet room filled with tension. The cowboy stood beside him, unsure why he had been called so suddenly. With trembling hands, the rancher grabbed his arm and whispered something that didn't make sense at first. "Marry her, and everything I own will be yours." The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The cowboy's heart raced, confused and uneasy, but before he could ask anything, the old man's eyes turned toward the door. A young woman stood there, silent and still, her face pale and unreadable. She didn't smile, didn't speak, and didn't move closer. Something about her felt wrong, like she was hiding more than just fear. The cowboy felt a chill run down his spine, because deep inside, he knew this wasn't just a simple promise. It was the beginning of something dangerous on a quiet, isolated ranch far from any town. A strong but lonely cowboy spent his days working under the burning sun and his nights in complete silence. Life had always been simple for him: hard work, no questions, and no one to care for. But that evening felt different. As the sky turned dark and the wind grew cold, a servant rushed to him with urgency and told him the rancher wanted to see him immediately. The cowboy wiped the dust from his hands and walked toward the old house, his heart slowly filling with unease. Inside, the air felt heavy and still, like time itself had stopped. The dying rancher lay weak on the bed, his eyes filled with something more than pain. The cowboy stepped closer, sensing that this moment would change everything, though he had no idea how deeply it would affect his life forever. The cowboy stepped closer to the bed, his eyes fixed on the dying rancher, who gathered the last of his strength and spoke in a weak but firm voice, telling him that there was something he must do if he wanted a future beyond endless struggle and loneliness. His grip tightening as he pointed toward the silent young woman standing near the door, revealing that she had been under his protection for a long time, and that her safety was now the most important thing left in his life. He whispered that the cowboy must marry her, and in return he would leave everything he owned to him: the land, the house, and all that came with it. The words struck the cowboy like a sudden storm, his mind racing with confusion as he looked between the fragile old man and the quiet woman whose expression remained distant and unreadable. He had spent his entire life working without hope of owning anything. Yet this offer felt too sudden, too strange, and filled with something he could not understand. The rancher's voice trembled again as he insisted there was no time to explain, only trust, only a promise that this decision would matter more than anything else. The cowboy felt a heavy weight settle in his chest as silence filled the room, the kind of silence that demanded an answer. His thoughts clashed between doubt and desperation, knowing that walking away meant returning to a life with nothing, while accepting meant stepping into a situation wrapped in mystery. His eyes slowly moved back to the young woman, noticing the faint fear hidden behind her stillness. Something in that moment made him realize that she was not part of a simple arrangement, but someone carrying a burden he could not yet see. The rancher's breathing grew weaker as he waited, and the cowboy understood that this was the last chance to decide. His voice finally broke the silence as he agreed, though uncertainty still lingered deep inside him. The old man's tense expression softened with relief, as if a final promise had been fulfilled, his hand slowly releasing its grip before falling still, leaving behind a quiet room filled with unanswered questions. The cowboy stood there, feeling the weight of his choice settle into reality. He had just accepted a future he did not understand, tied to a woman he did not know, bound by a promise made in a moment that felt both sudden and irreversible. And as he turned to look at her once more, he realized that whatever lay ahead would not be simple, because the silence she carried was not empty. It was hiding something that was waiting to be revealed. The cowboy remained still for a moment after the rancher's hand fell lifeless, the silence in the room growing heavier as he slowly turned toward the young woman, who had not moved an inch, her presence calm yet unsettling, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. Her eyes briefly met his before quickly looking away, and in that single glance he felt something he could not explain, a quiet sadness mixed with fear that made his chest tighten. He took a hesitant step closer, unsure of what to say or how to begin a conversation that neither of them had chosen. But before he could speak, she lowered her gaze and gently clasped her hands together, her fingers trembling slightly, revealing emotions she was trying hard to hide. The cowboy noticed Every small detail, the way she avoided his eyes, the way her breathing felt uneven, and the way she stood as if she did not belong there, like a stranger trapped in someone else's life. He cleared his throat and softly asked her name, his voice careful and uncertain, but she took a moment before answering, her words quiet and almost distant, as if speaking itself required effort. He repeated her name in his mind, trying to make sense of the situation, yet nothing felt real. Everything had changed too quickly, and now he was standing beside a woman who was suddenly tied to his future. The house around them felt colder, emptier, as if the rancher's passing had taken away the last sense of stability, leaving behind only questions. The cowboy tried to read her expression, searching for any sign of comfort or understanding, but all he found was silence, a silence that felt deeper than words. He offered to help her sit, but she gently refused, taking a small step back as if distance was the only thing keeping her steady. That single movement made him pause, realizing that whatever she was hiding was not something simple. It was something that made her cautious, guarded, and distant. As the minutes passed, the weight of their situation became clearer. They were now bound by a promise neither fully understood, and yet there was no easy way out. The cowboy felt a growing unease settle inside him, not because of the marriage itself, but because of the unknown truth that seemed to follow her every move. He noticed how she glanced toward the door, as if expecting something or someone, and that small detail sent a quiet warning through his mind. He tried once more to speak, to ask if she was all right, but she simply nodded without looking at him, her voice barely above a whisper as she assured him she was fine, though everything about her said otherwise. And in that moment, the cowboy realized that this was not just a strange agreement. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, something hidden beneath layers of silence and fear. And as he stood there beside her, he understood one thing clearly. Whatever secret she carried was not going to stay buried for long, and when it finally came out, it would change everything between them. The days that followed moved quickly, as if time itself refused to slow down for either of them. And before the cowboy could fully understand the weight of his decision, the small and quiet wedding was completed without celebration or joy. Only a few witnesses standing in silence as vows were spoken that felt more like an obligation than a promise. The bride remained distant throughout, her voice steady yet empty, her eyes never fully meeting his. And when it was over, nothing felt different except for the invisible bond now tying them together. Life on the ranch returned to its routine on the surface, but beneath that routine, something began to shift in ways the cowboy could not ignore. The first sign came during the night, when he woke to the faint sound of footsteps outside. He stepped out into the cold darkness, but found no one, only the soft wind moving across the land. The next morning she acted as if nothing had happened, her expression calm yet guarded, and when he asked if she had gone outside, she simply shook her head and turned away, avoiding further questions. As days passed, these small moments began to grow into patterns. She would disappear without explanation, returning hours later with a quiet tension in her face, her hands sometimes shaking as if she had been through something she refused to share. The cowboy started noticing letters that she kept hidden, carefully folding them away whenever he entered the room, her reaction quick and uneasy, as if those papers held something she feared he might discover. His curiosity slowly deepened into concern, and that concern turned into suspicion. He began to watch her more closely, observing the way she listened for distant sounds, the way she hesitated before answering even the simplest questions, and the way her eyes often carried a fear that did not belong in a place that should have been safe. One evening, as they sat across from each other in silence, he asked her directly if something was wrong, his voice calm but firm. She froze for a moment before forcing a small, unconvincing smile and assuring him that everything was fine, yet her hands tightened around the edge of the table, revealing the truth she tried to hide. The cowboy felt a growing tension inside him, not from anger, but from the feeling that he was living beside someone who was slowly slipping further away into a secret he could not reach. Nights became longer as he stayed awake, listening for movement, his mind filled with unanswered questions, and each time she stepped out into the darkness, the distance between them grew, turning silence into a barrier that words could not break. He wanted to trust her, to believe that whatever she carried would eventually be shared, but the unknown began to weigh heavily on him, creating a quiet fear that something far more serious was unfolding behind her silence. And as he stood one night watching her shadow disappear into the darkness once again, he realized that this was no longer just curiosity. It was a truth waiting to surface, and whatever it was, it had the power to change everything he thought he understood about her and the life they were now living together. That night, when the faint sound of movement reached his ears once again, the cowboy did not hesitate. He quietly stepped out of bed and followed her into the darkness, keeping a careful distance as her figure moved across the land with a sense of urgency he had never seen before. The cold air pressed against him as he walked silently behind her, his heart beating faster with every step. Unsure of what he was about to discover, she did not look back, as if she believed no one would ever question her actions. And that belief gave him the chance to see the truth for himself. She reached the far edge of the ranch where an old, abandoned shed stood hidden behind tall trees, a place no one had used for years. The cowboy slowed his pace and stayed in the shadows, watching as she gently pushed the door open and slipped inside. A faint light flickered through the cracks, and after a moment of hesitation, he moved closer, each step filled with tension. As he reached the door, he heard voices, not loud, but enough to make his chest tighten. He carefully looked through a narrow gap, and what he saw made everything inside him shift. The woman he had married was not alone. A young child sat beside her, weak and frightened, wrapped in a blanket as she spoke softly, trying to comfort the child with a tenderness he had never witnessed before. Her voice filled with emotion as she promised that everything would be all right, that they just needed a little more time. The cowboy felt a wave of confusion and shock, his mind racing as he tried to understand why she had hidden something so important. But before he could react, another voice entered the conversation, deeper and filled with warning. A man stepped forward from the shadows, his presence tense and cautious as he spoke about people searching, about danger getting closer, and about how staying on the ranch was no longer safe. The cowboy's breath caught as the truth began to unfold piece by piece. She was not just hiding a secret. She was running from something far greater than he had imagined, something that involved not only her, but also the child and the unknown man standing beside her. Fragments of their conversation revealed a painful past, a life filled with fear, escape, and a truth connected to the ranch itself, a truth that could take everything away if it came to light. The cowboy stepped back slowly, his thoughts spinning as the reality settled in. Every strange moment, every unanswered question now made sense, but instead of clarity bringing peace, it only deepened the conflict inside him. He had agreed to a promise without knowing the cost, and now that cost stood right in front of him, hidden in the shadows of a secret that could change everything. As he turned away from the shed, the weight of what he had seen pressed heavily on him, because he knew that from this moment forward, nothing would ever be simple again, and the choice he made next would decide not only his future, but theirs as well. That be why the time she returned to the house, the faint light of dawn had begun to touch the horizon, but the calm outside could not match the storm waiting inside. The cowboy stood near the doorway, his figure still and silent, yet there was a weight in his presence that immediately made her stop, her breath catching as she realized something had changed. His eyes met hers with a quiet intensity that left no room for denial, and before she could speak or turn away, he stepped forward and asked her where she had been, his voice low but firm, not filled with anger, but with something far more serious, a need for truth. She hesitated, her lips parting as if to form an answer, but no words came out, and in that silence, everything became clear. The cowboy did not raise his voice, did not accuse her with harshness. Instead, he simply told her what he had seen, each word slow and controlled, leaving no space for lies to hide. The moment those words reached her, the strength she had been holding onto finally broke. Her shoulders trembled, and her eyes filled with tears she could no longer contain. She stepped back as if the truth itself had pushed her, and then the quiet walls of her silence collapsed. She tried to speak, but her voice shook, the fear she had buried for so long rising to the surface. She confessed everything, not in a single breath, but in pieces filled with pain. She spoke of the child, not as a secret meant to deceive, but as someone she had been protecting with everything she had left. She revealed the danger that had followed her, people who were still searching, people who would not stop until they found what they wanted. And that truth was tied to the land itself, something hidden within it that others were willing to take by force. Her words carried guilt as she admitted she had no choice when the rancher offered her protection, no choice when the marriage became part of that protection. She had accepted it not for herself, but to keep the child safe. Her voice broke as she told him she never meant to drag him into this, never meant to make him part of something so dangerous. The cowboy listened without interruption, every piece of her story settling heavily inside him. And for the first time, he saw beyond the silence that had once made him uneasy. He saw the truth behind her distance, a truth filled with fear, sacrifice, and a quiet strength that had kept her going despite everything. The anger he might have felt faded into something deeper, something more human, as he realized she was not hiding out of deception, but out of desperation. Her final words came with a fragile honesty as she admitted she was ready to leave if that was what he wanted, ready to disappear again if it meant keeping him safe. But she could not run anymore without knowing she had tried to protect what mattered most. And as she stood there, broken yet honest, the cowboy understood that this moment was not about betrayal. It was about choice, a choice that would define everything that came next. The cowboy stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of her truth settling deep inside him as he looked at her not with doubt, but with understanding. And instead of turning away, he took a slow step closer and made a choice that changed everything. He told her she was not alone anymore, and that whatever danger followed her would now face him too, his voice steady and certain, giving her something she had not felt in a long time: safety. Her tears fell quietly as the fear in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a fragile hope. She thought she had lost forever. The ranch that once felt empty slowly became a place of warmth, where secrets no longer controlled their lives. And the child she protected finally smiled without fear. The land no longer mattered to him, because he had found something far greater. And in the end, they both realized that sometimes the hardest choices lead to a love strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds.